Natasha Hausdorff, welcome to my podcast.
Thank you so much. It's my pleasure to be here.
Thank you. You're to introduce you to my audience who are listening and watching now. You're a barrister. You're an expert on international law, including the law of armed conflict, foreign affairs, and national security policy. You hold law degrees from Oxford and Tel Aviv universities, and you've been a fellow in the National Security Law Program at Columbia Law School in New York, right so far? And you're also the legal director of UK Lawyers for Israel Charitable Trust.
That's spot on.
Yeah, that's a proper curriculum.
Yeah, well, well, thank you. I think there's been a lot of learning along the way for sure.
Yeah, and you're on some kind of like a tour here in Scandinavia now. You were in Copenhagen like 2 days ago, and you were in Bergen here in Norway yesterday, and now you're in Oslo. How has the experience been? Before we're going to dive into the deep stuff afterwards, but it's interesting to hear how your experience has been here in Scandinavia so far.
Sure. Well, it's not my first time in this part of the world, and I'm always struck by the important differences, cultural, and the differences between the peoples in each of these places, and in fact how they interact and how they discuss controversial issues. So I appreciate the approach in Denmark might be a little more reserved, but we were expecting a debate this evening in Oslo, which will perhaps be a little more lively than Copenhagen. But it's been great. It's extremely warm, and people have been especially welcoming to me.
That's great to hear. I saw your debate actually with in Copenhagen, which was led by Martin Krasnick, the editor of Weekend Avisen, the weekend newspaper, and two ladies from. One was from Amnesty International, and the other was from kind of a red-green kind of party. I don't remember the name of it. And one was a young guy from like a conservative party.
Yes.
And how do you feel that debate went, like in terms of, I think you were discussing genocide in particular,
which is an appalling accusation, and truly disappointing that a debate like that is necessary. I was disappointed, certainly, at the approach, in particular of the Amnesty International representative, where she sought to suggest that they weren't seeking to rewrite international law, even though the report itself makes it perfectly clear that this is what they're seeking to do. They acknowledge that accept the definition of genocide doesn't work, even on the basis of their factual misrepresentations. And so they make it clear that they're looking for an amendment, essentially, to the way that genocide is treated in international law by international courts and tribunals. So in some respects, not surprising, but it continues to be disappointing, especially as there's been continual demands that the recording be taken down, if you can believe it. So it strikes me that they didn't think it went so well for them, but to seek to cover up exchanges like this, when the whole purpose, of course, of the debate in Copenhagen was open debate and discussion of these very important issues and these obscene allegations. So all round, quite a disappointing attitude from what used to be, of course, one of the leading lights of the NGO world, especially in this part of the world.
Yeah, it's so sad, that kind of development, because I think that hurts those kinds of organizations, their reputation, because in essence and in principles, those kinds of organizations are really important for highlighting when there are atrocities against people. And then it's so unfortunate when they get, in my view, corrupted by blaming Israel for genocide, which we're going to dive into. But I just feel like they are smearing their own brand, so to say, and destroying their own credibility by doing so.
So it used to be the case that these organizations upheld these values, but Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch now have for many, many years been marked out as having an obsessional focus on the Jewish state. And the fact that reports both on the allegation of apartheid and now on genocide by both of these organizations, for example, have been replete with falsehoods, and where these reports rely on information as it transpired in the debate in Copenhagen, essentially from Hamas, us sources in order to put forward these obscene allegations. It's a dire state of affairs, but the consequences of this cannot be understated. And I said in the debate that Amnesty and others ultimately have blood on their hands because the consequences of this misinformation and propagating these ancient blood libels, in this case that, Jews kill children or starve children, we've seen what that has led to. Jews and Israelis being executed in the street. The abhorrent, tragic situation in DC outside the Jewish Museum is just the latest example of this. But there is a direct link between the misinformation that this NGO world, these civil society organizations have been propagating, and what it leads to in terms of these practical consequences and this surge in violent anti-Semitism that we've seen around the world.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, they wanted to take it down actually from their website, and I think that's so appalling also because I think that if it was the other way around, if they actually felt that if they won the debate, then probably they would have wanted to share it and spread it everywhere.
Well, it's pretty telling, isn't it? Yeah.
We're going to talk. I thought we were going to talk about some main points today, just to outline it. I want to talk about this argument that Israel is an occupying state, which is just thrown around everywhere. And I know that you have some different opinions about that in regards to like San Remo resolution and these things. We're going to talk about, of course, genocide and Amnesty International, and also blood libels and anti-Semitism, I thought. And I thought we could start with the whole thing about Israel being an occupying state, because I feel like this is at the core of everything. Who has the right to the area of Israel? Do we need to go back to, is it 1920 for the San Remo resolution?
Look, it depends who you ask. Some people like to go back to biblical times. Some people go back to the creation of the Mandate, San Remo. I believe that Israel should be treated in the same way as any other state under the international legal system. And there is clear law about the creation of states and their borders, which, if it applies to everyone else, certainly should apply to Israel. So I would advocate starting at Israel's Declaration of Independence for a clear indication of what the status of the territory here is. And you're right that this is an important point to start with, because this blood libel, essentially, of occupation, just like all of these other legal terms that have been abused and inverted against Israel, ethnic cleansing, colonialism, apartheid, and genocide, all of these pseudo-legal terms that are being weaponized and used for these political purposes have at their heart a focus on attacking the Jewish state through the pseudo-international legal system. But this notion of illegal occupation, for starters, doesn't actually exist anywhere else. Occupation is seen as a recognized framework in international law, which is applied where a sovereign has been ousted from their territory. So as a starting point, I would advocate you and listeners ask the question, whom is it occupied from? And invariably, no one can answer that, because the territory that we are speaking about in the context of East Jerusalem and Judea and Samaria, what some people call the West Bank, was in fact occupied by Jordan between 1949 and 1967, when Jordan attacked Israel the moment it declared independence. And then it was recovered by Israel in 1967. And the reason I say it was recovered by Israel is because of what international law tells us about Israel's borders at its Declaration of Independence. And this rule of uti possidetis juris is a customary rule of international law. It's universally applicable, and it applies wherever there is no agreement to the contrary. It's a default rule.
What does the words mean? What does the law and the rule mean in itself?
As you possess under law, essentially.
Uh-huh.
So the words themselves are less significant than what the rule denotes, which evolved, it's fair to say, over time. This is a rule that emerged over time, as customary rules do. It began with the withdrawal of the Spanish from South America in the 19th century. So this is a rule that emerges from a post-colonial context. And the idea behind it was to prevent a vacuum arising. So to prevent what was called terra nullius, no man's land. When the colonial power leaves the territory, there needed to be some sort of default mechanism that everyone knew what the lines were of the new states as they emerged. So when the International Court of Justice recognized the emergence of this rule, which from the 19th century was later applied in Asia, in Africa, at the dissolution of the former communist federations, and essentially to all states that emerged from mandates, as Israel did, and we'll come on to the specifics in a minute. When the court talked about the emergence of this rule, it talked about the reasons for it, to provide stability, certainty, and to prevent fratricidal struggles. So it's important to understand in the context of international law more broadly, all international law is looking to create order, to limit chaos. Even the laws of war are seeking to regulate what is the most chaotic state of affairs imaginable. And so everything pulls towards the direction of peace, peaceful interactions, and stability and certainty. And it's therefore that this rule states that a new state takes on whatever the lines were on the ground before, the pre-existing administrative lines of whatever entity preceded the state. So when you're thinking about the former communist federations breaking off into their contingent parts, they followed the pre-existing administrative units of that larger entity. The same with respect to the Mandate for Palestine, which, of course, when it was originally created, included Transjordan. The British severed that to create later the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, but the administrative line that separated Transjordan from the rest of the British Mandate was the line that ran all the way down along the Jordan River to the Red Sea. Importantly, it incorporates Jerusalem and the West Bank or Judea and Samaria. And that is the line, it's the only line in play that ultimately had to be Israel's border in 1948 on the 14th of May when David Ben-Gurion declared independence. Now, it's not required that Israel cite this rule. It's not required that Israel stake out this territory. In fact, the Declaration of Independence doesn't refer to borders at all. It refers to Eretz Israel, the land of Israel. And it's in the absence of there being any agreement that dictates what Israel's borders were between it and its neighbors, that this rule of uti possidetis iuris applies. And in fact, the agreements that do exist, importantly, the armistice agreements between Israel and Egypt and Israel and Jordan, underscore the importance of the administrative lines of the British Mandate because they refer back to the mandatory lines while they make clear that they don't recognize Israel in any borders because at the time neither Egypt nor Jordan recognized the legitimacy of the existence of the State of Israel. And it's very important to recognize that the pseudo language that has arisen, which was being quoted to me in Copenhagen, the Danish position is, we believe in the 1967 borders. Now, that's ludicrous on several levels because there's no such thing. These are not borders. This is a reference to the 1949 armistice lines. They do not date from 1967. And these are the very lines that Israel's neighbors said would never be considered borders and are illegitimate. It essentially simply designated where the two armies had reached when the ceasefire was agreed. So it was, demarcating the lines of the troops. It has no significance in international law, so we have to go back to the default rule. And the importance of international law, if it's going to be respected, has to be in its equal application. I can give a parallel example of uti possidetis iuris and how the international community engages with it in relation to Ukraine. Yeah. There's a general consensus that Russia has occupied Crimea from Ukraine. And the reason for that is that Ukraine's borders followed uti possidetis iuris. It doesn't matter about the makeup of the population there. It is about clean lines. It is about what the administrative lines before the creation of Ukraine were. So this general consensus on the basis of uti possidetis iuris holds. And if Ukraine were to recover Crimea from Russia in the context of this war, in the same way that Israel recovered Judea and Samaria and East Jerusalem from Jordan, from that Jordanian occupation that I mentioned, after 1949, Israel recovered that in 1967. I mean, let's think about that parallel. Do you think anyone other than Russia, do you think anyone would accuse Ukraine of occupying Crimea from Russia, when it's recovered in this hypothetical scenario, its territory? I very much doubt it. And yet it is this canard of illegal occupation that is at the center of so much of the vitriol against Israel. And it also stems, I have to say, from a misinformation campaign about the historical narrative. This idea that there was a state of Palestine or that the creation of Israel was illegitimate because it ousted people from their territory. This is all a pack of lies. The fact of the matter is that the only reason Israel was able to declare independence and successfully defend itself in a war of annihilation in 1948 that was launched upon it by all of its neighbors is because the Jewish Yishuv, the community, pre-state, had been building state institutions ready to declare independence the moment the British left. And that is exactly what they did. They were Palestinian Jews. There was no concept of exclusively Arab Palestinian national identity at the time. My grandparents were Palestinians. They were issued with identity cards by the British that said race, Jewish, nationality, Palestinian. So this concept of exclusively Arab Palestinian national identity only emerged much later in the 1960s with the creation of the Palestinian flag and the Palestinian national movement under Yasser Arafat. It's desperately sad that at the heart of that national movement is essentially the singular aim of the destruction of the state of Israel. Unlike the kind of positive national aspirations that the Jewish community espoused and put into action in order to create their state and declare independence, we've got the complete inverse of that in the movement that the so-called Palestine Liberation Organization, which of course was a terrorist organization, that Yasser Arafat was heading before ultimately the international community and Israel included gave him and that movement legitimacy and credibility. But this rewriting of the historical narrative goes hand in glove with the inversion and the abuse of international law in order to create this received wisdom, in order to create this notion of, well, everybody says Israel's an occupier. Everybody says is not how you run a legal system, it's how you run a lynch. And we have seen that lynch mob embrace this false narrative, embrace this inversion of international law, and we've seen the desperate consequences of it, not just for Israel's ability to defend itself against unspeakable atrocities and terror. These are the proxies, of course, of the Islamic Republic in Iran, but also, of course, the appalling consequences for Jews around the world stem from this rewriting of history and this rewriting of law.
When Israel declared itself a state in 1948, how important was the San Remo resolution? Then is that like a keystone? Is an important thing for everything to be built upon?
So I see it as important historical and legal context. I mean, this is an important international commitment, if you will, and we shouldn't overlook the purpose of the Mandate for Palestine, which had at its core the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people. I mean, that was a commitment that was continually betrayed by the British when they refused Jewish immigrants in the course of the Holocaust. In fact, turned away migrants that were later to meet their deaths in concentration camps. And there were many other instances in terms of the treatment of the Jewish communal institutions, pre-state institutions, and unfortunately the tensions between British forces while they remained in that area, the dwindling years of the British Mandate, and the resistance, some say also terror, organizations that were seeking to get the British to leave. So those commitments that the Brits and the international community had made prior to the establishment of a Jewish home were betrayed. You had confiscation of arms from the Jewish community just before the Declaration of Independence, which made it even harder for them to defend themselves against the onslaught, the genocidal war of annihilation, which was immediately declared upon them. But I see it as historical and legally significant context. I completely accept the legal arguments that are advanced by others. I don't even think we need to go there. The starting point of Israel's Declaration of Independence and equal treatment for Israel to all other states and the way that they are established and the way that their territorial integrity is thereafter respected. I mean, it is appalling to see pseudo-declaration after declaration recognizing a so-called state of Palestine, which is essentially an attack on the territorial integrity and sovereignty of the State of Israel, and a complete upending of international agreements, the Oslo Accords included, which have been endorsed by so many of these states that have made increasingly problematic public declarations vis-a-vis Israel and the prospects of a future state of Palestine. And the reason I say that it's upending them, it's tearing them up, is because, the Oslo Accords made it clear that borders, that all of this was a matter for final status negotiation. Those negotiations have failed because Israel is faced with essentially a Palestinian leadership that has embraced terrorism. Not, of course, just Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Fatah, and the rest of them, but the so-called moderates in the Palestinian Authority. They have been funding terrorism through their pay-for-slay scheme. And they paid terrorists of every denomination. It doesn't matter what banner they coalesce under. The Hamas terrorists that planned the 7th of October attacks, the heads of the Nukhba force, so-called, were, many of them were collecting stipends, payments, pay-for-slay salaries from the Palestinian Authority, which by all accounts enabled them to sit back and plan these attacks without having to go out and work for a living.
A criticism of the Sanremo is that, they did that declaration, but it never demarcated any lines. It didn't have any, they didn't talk about any borders. It never defined where the land of Israel should be. How do we respond to that? Or how do you respond to that when people criticize that? They declared the Israeli state, but they never really defined it on the map where it's supposed to be.
Well, so Sanremo didn't declare a state of Israel. No. Israel did this.
Yeah.
And that's where uti possidetis juris comes in, because in the absence of any agreement on borders, this is the default rule. And I think it's so important just to stress the fact that Israel has not been created by the international community, either under Sanremo or by the United Nations.
Yeah, because a lot of people think that. When you speak to people on the street, they think that, UN actually created the state of Israel in 1947, they think. And it's no, they actually declared themselves in 1948. But why do people walk around thinking that?
It's part of the misinformation. I think it's put forward because of this notion that, well, if the UN created it, it can decreate it. It can, and there is an increasing movement, right, to have Israel wiped off of the map. One which was, I hope you're sitting down, endorsed by the International Court of Justice in the non-legally binding, of course, advisory opinion that it gave last year, essentially calling for the ethnic cleansing of Jews from Judea and Samaria and from East Jerusalem, and wiping Israel off the map when it talked about the contiguous nature of Palestinian territory. So that sentiment on the street of the UN created it, maybe the UN can take Israel away, has filtered through UN bodies, but even up to the highest judicial body of the United Nations, the International Court of Justice. And it's desperately concerning that we're seeing, cartology being thrown out of the window, law being thrown out of the window, and the history of the matter. I think the reason that people focus incorrectly on 1947 is, of course, this was the partition resolution. This was the United Nations General Assembly putting forward a proposal, a recommendation. Now, General Assembly resolutions are not legally binding. They are political resolutions. And this political resolution put forward a recommendation which was never implemented. Unlike partition in the case of India, Pakistan, which was followed through, this was a proposal that was rejected by the local Arab population, by
because Israel actually signed it, didn't they? But the other part didn't sign it.
It wasn't a case of signing it, but Israel welcomed it. They welcomed it because it was an endorsement by the United Nations on the creation of the State of Israel. But ultimately, because there's no buy-in from the other parties here, because they refused to accept Israel in any borders, when Israel finally declared independence, there's no agreement on boundaries. There's no internationally binding proposal on what the state of Israel is going to look like. And so you have to fall back into those default rules. And, I've seen, especially as I've started to speak a lot more about uti possidetis juris, because it's remarkable to me that it's just not been part even of the academic debate on this. It's been squashed. It was raised in the context of the ICC jurisdictional question already back in 2020. And the prosecutor at the time, Fatou Bensouda, responded, seeking to justify her position that uti possidetis juris didn't apply. She failed. She didn't engage with the application of this rule. We've seen a similar state of affairs at the International Court of Justice, where the vice president of the court raises uti possidetis juris as part of her dissent and says, look, the majority of the court failed to engage with fundamental parts of international law, fundamental rules of international law and their application to this situation. How can they be taken seriously in this context? But as I've been speaking more and more about it, some people have proffered alternative views. I have failed in the last 10 years of having these discussions sometimes with leading academics in this field. I have failed to receive a single explanation as to why, uniquely in this case, uti possidetis juris ought to be disapplied. I've heard references to the partition resolution, and we've already talked about why this political resolution, which was never implemented, doesn't take us any further. I've also heard references to, the Palestinians have a right of self-determination, which I think is worth unpacking for a moment, because in the context of international law and where we've moved to on the issue of self-determination, absolutely, I don't think anyone would argue with that. Self-determination does not give one a right to a state. If it did, the Kurds would have a state for sure. There would be hundreds more states in the world. Self-determination does not trump territorial integrity of existing states, that existing framework. And that's clear. The Supreme Court of Canada, in the case re the secession of Quebec, talks about this in great detail, which has been taken to be such an authoritative statement on international law on this point that it's almost just said to become part of customary law. This explanation of how peoples are expected to self-determine within existing territorial frameworks. And of course, the Palestinians have an autonomy. They have self-governance in the West Bank, in areas A and B. They had self-governance from 2005 in Gaza, and we've seen what's happened there with the violent takeover of Hamas in 2007. So all of these arguments that have been proffered, I'm afraid, don't cut the mustard. Nothing in this vein other than kind of wishful thinking. And I don't particularly like Israel. I have some ideological, political opposition to it. Therefore, I want to disapply fundamental international law so far as its borders are concerned. That's what these arguments essentially amount to. And that's just not an acceptable position, in my respectful opinion.
But how is the international courts able to just look away from these uti possidetis juris and just not apply it as applicable law? How are they able to get away with that?
So in the context of the ICC, we saw a series of legal acrobatics, thank you, in terms of the decision of the pretrial chamber in 2021 to seek to justify jurisdiction for the court to investigate Israelis where the court has no jurisdiction. And a big part of this is to do with understanding the territory of the State of Israel and the fact that the Palestinian Authority is not a state. And in seeking to overcome these issues, there are a number of arguments that were put forward. One line of argumentation, if I can paraphrase, essentially said that the reason the Palestinians aren't a state is because of the conduct of Israel, and therefore that shouldn't be held against them. I mean, again, that's not an argument that resonates in international law, but it's also factually incorrect. The reason that the Palestinians don't have a state today is as a result of every offer that would lead to, either statehood or let's say statehood minus, right? A Palestinian autonomy that has everything except the ability to threaten Israel on its border. It's been rejected by the Palestinian leadership over and over again. Just listen to the American presidents that presided over some of those negotiations. They don't have skin in this game in terms of blaming Yasser Arafat, for example, for having refused essentially everything that he was offered, except one thing, which was the so-called right of return, which is a euphemism for the destruction of the State of Israel. So in seeking to overcome this position in fundamental customary international law, we've had these sort of political arguments. We've also had reliance on UN resolutions, which are political instruments. And we've had this fudging, both at the ICC and now also at the ICJ, of law and politics. And that's the way that in each case, the majority, and it has been the majority, because there was a very powerful dissent from Judge Kovacs at the ICC in 2021, and a very powerful dissent from Judge Sebutinde in the ICJ across the last year, in essentially in every opinion and preliminary measures ruling that has been issued by the court in respect of Israel, she has been dissenting and calling out the failure of the court to engage with this fundamental international law in favor of the political arguments that they have endorsed.
I thought that, like international law, it was a professional field that people would actually follow the law, and people are professionals, that it would have kind of a mutual understanding of the law. But it seems like when I look at this from the outside, it seems like there are wildly different interpretations of everything. Is like, how are you able to square that everybody in this field are able to have that much of a difference of opinion what is applicable law or not?
So there are a couple of points here. First is that there has been a capture of the academy, and in particular the International Legal Academy, for many, many years. Unless you have drunk the Kool-Aid on Israel, you will not advance as an academic. You will not get tenure. And that's particularly important in the field of international law because there is such a crossover between the academy and international legal practice and international legal tribunals. So I'll give you an example. When I was a fellow at Columbia Law School in 2018 in the National Security Law Program, at the law school was Sarah Cleveland, who is now America's judge on the ICJ. And having attended some of her lectures, I was in no doubt as to what her political leanings were on some of these issues. That has, of course, been confirmed in some of the opinions that she has rendered so far while a judge on behalf of America at the International Court of Justice. And there's this backwards and forwards. The former president of the ICJ, Joan Donoghue, is now a member of a chambers in London. So there's this cyclical movement between practice and academia, which essentially has this kind of self-fulfilling anti-Israel, unfortunately, political input into the way that international law is being developed. You also have a very, very important cyclical framework in the context of civil society organizations. Now, we began our discussion with talking about Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, Oxfam, and it's imperative that people understand how it is that you can get to a position where, well, everybody says, the UN, Amnesty International, the International Court of Justice. But the reason that everybody says Israel is, a pariah state is because they're all reinforcing the other. And ultimately, they base their assessments on information that is coming from prescribed terrorist organizations. The only information coming out of the Gaza Strip at the moment is controlled by Hamas. That is the information that is being fed into NGO reports. That is the information that is then being fed into UN Special Rapporteur reports. That is the information that is then fed into UN resolutions. That is the information that is then fed into the International Court of Justice or the ICC when they're relying on those UN resolutions. And then the civil society organizations, in turn, rely on what the ICJ or the ICC have said to inform the next round of anti-Israel reports that include extremely problematic, misleading, and I would say even false information about Israel and international law. So that's why you get this vicious cycle. And, when Mehdi Hasan and others have said to me, is the UN wrong then? Is Amnesty International wrong then? Are they all wrong? The answer is yes. And it's yes for the same reason, because they're all relying on the same false information. This is not a new cyclical circle of disinformation. This has been going for decades. And it is also, in many, many respects, reflective of something far more sinister, I think, underlying where international law is being pushed to, where it is being manipulated to. And it is a battle between rule of law countries like Norway, the UK, Israel, the US, and the despots and the dictatorships in the world, like Russia, China, and Iran. Rule of law countries view law as a curtailment on government power. Non-rule of law countries view law as a means of wielding power. And you can see that tension in the context of certainly UN resolutions and debates, but also in the drafting of certain international conventions. And for so long, rule of law countries have essentially been on the back foot in pushing back against this manipulation of international law to suit the interests of the despots and dictatorships and their terror proxies. And that, in so many respects, has informed, but also been supported by, because there's this back and forth symbiotic relationship there also, by these civil society organizations. And a big question that we need to be asking is, where's the funding for so many of these NGOs coming from? Because I think if you follow the money, you'll also start to see an awful lot of these puzzle pieces fall into place about why it is that these once respected organizations are now doing the bidding of dictatorships, terror proxies, and those forces that really want to see the destruction of Western civilization.
Do you know if there's any evidence out there of like Amnesty or other NGOs being actually funded by Qatar or Iran or Russia or like any of these states? Do you know if there's anything out there?
Not off the top of my head, but I do know that there are organizations very much looking into this. I imagine FDD, Foundation for Defense of Democracies, I know they do a lot of investigation of terror financing. NGO Monitor is another excellent resource on following the money and understanding where these NGOs are often getting their funding from. So I would certainly advocate more investigation into this phenomenon.
Because I'm thinking, like, the question that pops into my mind is, like, for Amnesty, what's in it for them? It's like, why are they out before the courts concluding that Israel is committing genocide before the court has even ruled? Like, what's in it for them? Why would they do that? Is it follow the money? Is it like...
It strikes me that there are probably a number of factors. Following the financials is very important here. But there's also this sort of movement and received wisdom that one needs to adhere to a particular catechism to be acknowledged as a good, decent person. And increasingly, that has included a vitriolic hatred of the Jewish state and an acknowledgement that Israel is responsible for, if not all the world's evils, then at least the evils in the Middle East. And we can see, and again, that there were many books that have been written on this. Jake Wallace Simons' Israelophobia is a recent one that tracks a misinformation campaign, but how this has fit together with woke culture. Douglas Murray, of course, is another great author on
I'm reading
these
his latest book
topics.
now. That's a great book. People should read it.
On death cults and democracies, absolutely. And that certainly tracks the phenomenon post the 7th of October, but this has been many, many decades in the making. In fact, Jake tracks it from the Soviet anti-Zionist propaganda and how so much of that has permeated through left-wing thinking, so that we have this, seemingly unholy alliance between the extreme left and the Islamists. But of course, increasingly, we've heard so many Iranian dissidents warning that this is how Iran fell. It was that exact alliance between the left and the Islamists, and so much of this began at the universities and took over the political sphere that led to the downfall of Iran and the Islamist takeover. And those warnings need to be heeded, because I'm afraid to say this is exactly what we are witnessing play out in the West. And it's part and parcel of this badge of honor that so many of these, I saw it. I saw it in the Amnesty representative that attended the debate yesterday. We had a cordial exchange before the debate began. She seemed to me to be a good person. I'm sure she absolutely believes in what she is doing. It's just that the arguments and the pseudo-facts that are contained in Amnesty's genocide reports don't hold water. And it's baffling to me that so many people have been taken in by this pseudo fight for justice and human rights, which is in fact doing the exact opposite of what it is that these good-willed, good-natured, good-intentioned people seek to achieve.
Yeah, it brings to mind a quote from Jordan Peterson, who said that I don't think that people hold ideologies. It's ideologies that hold people in its grip, right? So
that's very powerful.
Yeah, I think so, because people aren't even aware of what
Sure.
they're consumed by and persuaded by, and what lens that makes you look at the world through. In regards to like the UN and Amnesty, what is in the West, and in particular here in Norway, what you're up against if you have a dissenting opinion about what is going on in Israel is that it's like almost a David and Goliath situation, because people hold these NGOs in such high esteem, in such high regard. Like here in Norway, it's like UN is almost like God in a secular society.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Especially in this part of the world, they're sacred.
Yeah,
they have a godlike status.
Yeah,
and I was warned about this before going into the debate in Copenhagen. And almost told to just to try and moderate my message, to put it gently, which is very difficult. I mean, this is not a message that one can easily deliver with a cup of tea and a biscuit. It's diabolical. It is necessary to say that the emperor has no clothes, that these organizations that have this sacred, godlike status here are ultimately fueling the worst hatred against the Jewish people that we have seen since the Holocaust, and violent anti-Semitism on the streets of the free world. And they need to be held to account for this. Now, that's the macro level. But what I and others at UK Lawyers for Israel and NGO Monitor and other organizations have done is demonstrate in detail why each of these reports put out by these organizations, and it's the same for the famine reports of the IPC and the FRC that have been consistently shown to be wrong. We have provided a detailed review, detailed analysis that demonstrates why it is that they get to these false predictions that enable this canot of starvation to be spread around the world, how it is that they have relied on false data, on incomplete data, or reached what, in fact, even UN bodies have called implausible conclusions, and how that misinformation has basically been built up and spun into, Tom Fletcher, 14,000 babies will die in 48 hours. I mean, that ludicrous allegation should have collapsed under the weight of its own absurdity, right? But it is embraced and endorsed because, and this is the critical thing here, people seem to be so ready to believe the most heinous false allegations against the Jewish state and the Jewish people. And this is why I link it to the modern blood libel. The ancient blood libel was that Jews were killing Christian children to use their blood for religious ritual, or even to make matzah for Passover, right? Ridiculous, we think today, but they were really widely believed at the time. The modern blood libels are as ridiculous. Israel's targeting children. Israel's starving children. Babies are being starved by the evil state of Israel. They are as ridiculous, but they are now as widely believed as the ancient blood libels were in their time. And these godlike organizations are at the center of spreading this very dangerous misinformation.
It's almost as if these blood libels are passed down through the generations in the zeitgeist and subconsciously, because it's exactly the same as in the medievals and in these blood libels. It's just that I thought we were done with them. I thought that they belong to the past, to that part of history that we're no longer associated with. But I'm starting to feel like this is actually subconsciously passed down through generations, almost in our DNA, that kind of tendency to so easily believe these libels against Jews.
What can I say? History repeats itself, doesn't it?
Yeah. Let's see where we are here. We have to talk about, obviously, genocide in itself, the topic of that.
Sure.
I think the most telling thing, if people go in and watch the debate that was in Copenhagen, is that Amnesty International, they were so eager and so bombastically and easily concluded in their report that Israel is committing genocide. But when they were pressed and asked, did Hamas commit genocide on the 7th of October? No, there's no evidence to suggest that. We wouldn't like.
I think one of the responses was, we're still working on that.
Oh, really?
I seem to recall that. Obviously, there was a lot of back and forth. Yeah, they're still working on whether or not the atrocities of Hamas that they documented on GoPros and celebrated and sent around the world and were perfectly clear what their genocidal intent was and threatened to do this over and over again. That's not evident to them. But in the middle of a war where they're relying on information from Hamas and deliberately ignoring all of the material that is put out publicly by the State of Israel, the forces that actually know what's happening, like how much aid is going into the Gaza Strip, which is documented by COGAT on a weekly basis. They update the totals on their website. They entirely ignore that. I mean, the double standards and the hypocrisy are just mind-blowing.
I think that is one of the main parts of why they didn't want that video spread everywhere, because there's no logical consistency there.
Well, hopefully you can include a link to the debate with this podcast.
Definitely, because that would at least give them a little bit more credibility if they were like absolutely crystal clear that 7th of October was a genocide. Like that would give them a little bit tiny more credibility. But when they're not even able to say that, it's like they just fall through. And let's start with beginning with genocide. What are the actual legal criteria for a court to actually sentence a state for committing genocide? Isn't the legal criteria rather high? The threshold is rather high to do that.
So I think the starting point has to be the definition of genocide under the Convention for the Prevention and Punishment. And it's in two parts. The most important part is intention. I'll come back to that because the second part is the acts that it references. And it gives a short list of the sorts of acts that would be part of genocidal conduct, including killing members of a group and creating circumstances that make life impossible for them. So that's the list of acts, but they are superseded by the most important part of the definition, which is the intention to commit genocide. It's called the specific intent of this crime, and it is at the essence of what genocide is about. Of course, this was a term that was coined after the Jewish experience of the Holocaust to provide a legal terminology to that experience of being targeted for extermination because you are Jewish. That intention to eradicate a group in whole or in part, an ethnic, racial, religious, or national group, that is at the core of what genocide is. And that is what separates it out from other crimes against humanity.
Because the Holocaust was so horrible that there was not even legal language to describe it.
And specifically this idea of trying to wipe out a group of people. Genocide, that's where the word comes from. There was actually a battle, if you will, between Raphael Lemkin and Hersch Lauterpacht after the war as to whether or not this should be the way to define those crimes against the Jewish people, whether crimes against humanity was broad enough to incorporate it. But ultimately, genocide won out because it recognizes something that is even more, in some respects, than a crime against humanity, because you are seeking to annihilate a people. And that was, I think, rightly recognized as something, the heinousness of which needed to be separately catered for, separately defined. So that is the origin of genocide, the definition of genocide, which focuses on that intent to eradicate a people. Now, I talked about occupation, ethnic cleansing, colonialism, apartheid, and genocide as each being an inversion and a weaponization of international law. But I think there's something even more heinous happening here, which is in each of these contexts, what was done to the Jewish people is what the Jewish people are being accused of. Psychologists refer to this as projection, right? Douglas Murray, of course, in quoting Vasily Grossman, talks about it in the context of tell me what you are guilty of and I'll tell you what you accuse the Jews of. So there are lots of different ways of analyzing this phenomenon, but it is a phenomenon that exists across each of these terms. Jews existed through hundreds of years of occupation. Some would say that my grandparents lived under British occupation in the context of the Mandate. Ethnic cleansing, that has been the Jewish experience for thousands of years. Latterly, of course, we've seen the ethnic cleansing of Jews from the Arab world, those that fled to Israel. We also saw the ethnic cleansing of Jews from East Jerusalem and Judea and Samaria during Jordan's occupation, right? That is the real ethnic cleansing here. There's been ethnic cleansing of Jews in areas A and B of the West Bank, which are Palestinian Authority controlled. Jews can't go there for their safety. I mean, there are big red signs that warn any Israelis from going in, but let's be frank here, Arab Israelis don't have a problem with going in and out. It's Jewish Israelis that need to fear for their lives there. Gaza was ethnically cleansed of Jews in 2005 with Israel's withdrawal. Even graveyards were dug up. Not even dead Jews could remain because of what would be done to them, the feared desecration of these bodies in these graveyards, which is in fact exactly what happened in East Jerusalem. My ancestor's gravestone was taken and used to pave a nearby road by the Jordanians. So this is in no way a one-off and in no way unusual, but that ethnic cleansing is exactly what the Jews have been accused of perpetrating.
And also a digression here is that they always talk about the Nakba of 700,000 Palestinians losing their homes after 1948, but nobody's talking about the 900,000 or so Jewish people who were expelled or had to leave because of persecution in the Arabic states surrounding them.
There's another false narrative around what happened in 1948, which has been embraced and endorsed, in particular by the so-called revisionist historians. I would advocate very strongly looking at the facts and looking at histories, in particular published by Eliezer Tauber on the myth of Deir Yassin, and actually understanding that this myth of the Nakba, of ethnic cleansing, is disproven on many levels. First, on the level that many Arabs stayed. And in fact, 20% of Israel's population comprises Israeli Arabs today. Second, even Benny Morris, who has been consistently misrepresented in what he has written, was clear that there was never any policy of expulsion by the Israeli authorities. On the contrary, Tochnit Dalet was all about civilly administering Arab villages that didn't engage in the fighting. And those that did, those that were part of the conflict, of course, they needed to be fought and defeated. And then we've got individual instances of these alleged massacres, like Deir Yassin, which have now been entirely debunked, not only because the eyewitnesses there have said, given interviews, even on the BBC 27 years ago, making it clear that there was no rape and no slaughter, but also, and actually this is worth dwelling on for a moment, we have heard an explanation as to what happened and why many, many Arabs chose to flee, totally independently of Israeli action or Israeli messaging. There was an interview with Hassim Nusseibeh. He comes from a very prominent Jordanian family. Prominent, in fact, in East Jerusalem, and then he was an ambassador of Jordan. He has no reason to lie about this. He has no incentive to seek to put Israel's case or anything like that. And he talks about taking down a false press release from an individual called Dr. Kaladi, well known at the time, a false press release of what happened in Deir Yassin, to say that there was a slaughter, that women were raped. In fact, I think that pregnant mothers had their bellies cut open. This was one of the myths that had come out of Deir Yassin. And he challenged this false press release. He says, why would we be saying this? Essentially, it didn't happen. And he was told, we have to put this out in order to engender an uprising against the Jews from amongst the local Arab population. He was very honest in this interview on the BBC 27 years ago, and he said, this was our biggest mistake. The moment that the Arab population heard women had been raped, which was false, the moment they heard this, they fled. It had the opposite of the intended effect. Rather than rising up and joining the fight, the war of annihilation against the Jews, they fled, independent of what Israel was doing and fighting for its existence at the time. Now, it's extremely striking to me that history repeats itself, because we saw this whole scenario play out all over again. Do you remember reports on Al Jazeera alleging instances of rape at Al-Shifa Hospital in the context of the Gaza war?
Yeah, maybe, yeah.
They were around for about a week.
Mm-hmm.
And then Al Jazeera walked them back.
Ah.
Now, my understanding of this is that Hamas told them to deny those reports. These were reports that were false. There had been no rape at Al-Shifa, but they were put out seemingly with the notion that it would encourage some of the local Gaza population to either engage with Israeli forces or as part of this general propaganda of demonizing Israel to the world. This is an allegation that is frequently made against Israeli soldiers, which has repeatedly been shown to have been false. The reason it was walked back at the request of Hamas is that it caused Palestinians to flee the area. They were losing their human shields. And it's just extraordinary to think that the same mistake that was recognized by Qasem Nusayba 77 years ago, replayed in the context of Al Jazeera's false reports and Hamas immediately seeking to retract that false information because of the impact that it was having on Palestinians fleeing these areas the moment that they heard that women had been raped. They believed it. They believed this false information. So I just think it's important for just to expand on that point, and I know we're going on several tangents, because the reality of what happened in 1948 has been manipulated and has been weaponized. We hear it in marches on the street, and we hear it even in classrooms and in university lectures, and that false position that, the Jews ethnically cleansed people is an inversion of what happened. And as you say, completely ignores the ethnic cleansing of Jews from Arab lands, as well as the history of ethnic cleansing that the Jewish people have suffered in the land of Israel itself. Colonialism, of course, is another important inversion, that the Jews are the decolonization success story, re-establishing the state of Israel. They were the victims of colonialism for so many hundreds of years. Apartheid is an appalling accusation. Anyone just needs to go to Israel to see that that's not the case. But it's part and parcel of finding, the worst crimes that you can accuse a state of and attaching that to the Jewish state, attaching that to Israel. There is an apartheid that exists in that area, and that is in the Palestinian-controlled territories where you don't have Jews. They have been cleansed of their Jews. They are Judenrein, if you will. That is the real apartheid. But then we come on to genocide. And this is a grotesque inversion, not just of the Jewish experience in the Holocaust, but of course also of what happened on the 7th of October, which were real acts of genocide by Hamas and other Palestinian terrorist groups with the intention of killing Jews because they are Jews. And let's not forget that so much of this is rooted in one of the core drivers of this conflict, which is the indoctrination to terror. Many of the Palestinian terrorists that crossed the border on the 7th of October had never seen a Jew before. The first Jews they encountered were those that they raped, slaughtered, burned, mutilated, tortured, and abducted, because Jews had been ethnically cleansed from Gaza. Many of those, occasionally they're interviewed, they still talk about Jews in the context of having horns and tails, because this is the propaganda that they are subject to. From kindergarten up, in UNRWA-run schools, these Palestinians are taught that the highest calling in life is to become a martyr and to slaughter as many Jews as possible. And this is why it shouldn't be hard for Amnesty International and others to recognize the acts of genocide that were conducted, because Yahya Sinwar had been calling for many years before to pull down the border and tear out their livers and their hearts. Now that imagery is very powerful in the Arab world, and it has been repeated over and over again. I don't know if you recall the lynching of 2 reservists in 2000.
Yeah. Where the symbolism of the red hands are from, right?
That's absolutely right. So these were 2 Israeli reservists that lost their way. They ended up in Ramallah in the West Bank. They went to a local police station looking for help, and they were lynched. And as part of this lynching, this mob tore out their entrails, and there are photographs of the attackers eating their livers. And you're absolutely right that one of the attackers, one of the lynchers, held up his bloodied hands to the window, and below, outside of this police station, is this baying mob that go wild at this sight. And this is exactly the red hand symbol that so many Hollywood actors have endorsed. I imagine through ignorance as opposed to malice, but still, that symbol is recognizable across the Arab world for what it stands for, which is the lynching of Jews. This is what happens, unfortunately, and this is the inversion. This is what Yahya Sinwar called for. This is what happened on the 7th of October. It wasn't the first time that this sort of massacre and medieval barbarism has been meted out by Arabs to Jews in that part of the world. And this is what is being inverted. Where
do you think that comes from, that extreme hate that causes people to rip out the entrails of people and eat their livers? Like, how do you get to that level of hate? What is the Arabic or the Islamic anti-Semitism? Where does it stem from?
Pure indoctrination.
Yeah.
From your mother's cradle, through kindergarten, through school, where you're learning arithmetic on the basis of how many martyrs you're counting, or you're learning physics on the basis of how to use a slingshot, or you're watching Palestinian kids' TV, where a bumblebee tells you the trees will come to life and reveal the Jews hiding behind them and tell you to come and slaughter them. Or you revere martyrs because your football club is named after one. Or you celebrate and reenact terror attacks as part of school plays. It comes from this relentless abuse of children. Now, we've seen reforms to some of that in other parts of the Middle East. The UAE completely reformed its textbooks and its education system. Saudi has done something similar. But until we grapple with what is at the heart of this genocidal war against the Jews, until we grapple with this indoctrination to terror, there's never going to be any progress here. Until we do that, and we also need to grapple with the incentivization to terror. I talked about the pay-for-slay policy, I think, earlier. Yeah. That is being funded by the international community.
It's crazy.
And it's that incentivization and indoctrination to terror which is ultimately what is pushing peace further and further away.
But the fact that kids are taught this in school, where does that again stem from originally? Does a lot of this lead back to Iran for the Ayatollahs' hate for, they call Israel for little Satan and the US for big Satan? Is that the original place where this is coming from, do you think? Or?
I think it actually predates Iran because if you think about the creation of UNRWA in 1949 and really its activities that began in earnest in 1950, the whole notion of the creation of this unique Palestinian refugee status that is passed down generation to generation, right? That doesn't exist anywhere else in the world, right? Refugees are settled and they take on usually the citizenship of the place where they arrive. And at least in Israel, the refugees that fled to Israel from the Arab world were embraced and became productive members of society. Only the Palestinian Arabs have been uniquely kept in this limbo for generations in so-called refugee camps in Syria, in Lebanon, in Jordan, in Egypt, and even in Palestinian-controlled areas now, in Gaza and in the Palestinian Authority-controlled areas of Judea and Samaria. You have what are referred to as refugee camps, supposedly in Palestinian territory. But why are they refugees? Because this whole notion of the creation of UNRWA and the creation of this Palestinian refugee status was to hold in abeyance this population for when Israel was annihilated. Once they'd pushed the Jews into the sea, there would be space in Haifa, in Jerusalem, in Tel Aviv, Yaffo. And this is where, and you see it throughout the education process in UNRWA-run schools. Where are you from, they say. And they'll give you a town in Israel. Where are you going back to? and going back to that town when we kill the Jews. This is the standard refrain, and it is strategic, and it is carefully orchestrated, and it is supported by the United Nations. And ultimately, it was part and parcel of the very idea of setting up UNRWA to keep alive the war of annihilation against Israel. And the so-called Palestinian refugee problem or crisis is the linchpin for that perpetual war of annihilation against the Jews.
But with the UN supporting UNRWA this way, how do countries and states keep their memberships in the UN? Why don't they retract and pull out of the UN and protest against this stuff?
Who's going to go first?
Yeah, Israel.
Who's going to go first when this is the World Club? This is where everyone comes to be important, to give their speeches. It's one of the reasons, one of the driving forces behind the Palestinian Authority's so-called foreign policy was to become a member of the UN, not to actually engage in state building, to organize bin collections, garbage collections. I don't know what the terminology is here. To set up the kind of state institutions that I mentioned the Jewish community pre the State of Israel had up and running already, ready to go. Yasser Arafat, Mahmoud Abbas have no interest in actual state building. They just want to come to the podium of the United Nations, slam their fist on the table and blame Israel for all of their problems. But it's significant that they want to come and do that at the UN, because for all of its faults and deep, deep faults, and I don't just mean, all of these stories of cover-up at the UN, of corruption, of true evil, the way that UN organizations have behaved in some parts of Africa and the developing world, and the allegations surrounding abuse of children and sexual abuse of children in exchange for food, just as low as one can possibly imagine. And of course, its involvement in terror and the complicity of UNRWA, not just in the 7th of October atrocities and the UNRWA employees that were directly involved, but also subsequently in supporting Hamas and in keeping hostages. Emily Damari, the British hostage, explained to Keir Starmer, the British Prime Minister, that she was held in an UNRWA facility in Gaza, and the UK has increased its funding to UNRWA. It's remarkable. But ultimately, when faced with being part of the United Nations and this pretense of what the UN was intended to stand for, promotion of world peace, and taking on the very, very difficult reality of what the United Nations is, what it has become, and all of the harm it is doing, nobody wants to face that. So I can entirely understand, but until we do, until the League of Democracies, the rule of law countries actually stand up for real justice, real human rights, real international law, this macabre, very concerning, devastating development is simply going to continue.
I think I read last night, that the UN is actually almost running out of money, that by September they might be bankrupt.
Well, America, I say who's going to start, right? Yeah. Okay, so I think it's fair to say that America has already taken, under this administration, a very significant step in terms of its funding of the UN, in terms of, its recent demand that Francesca Albanese be thrown out of her position as UN Special Rapporteur in light of the appalling blood libels that she is spreading against the Jewish people. So America has certainly taken a significant step in a very positive direction, I would suggest, in terms of holding the United Nations to account. One might think, in fact, that a congressional inquiry into the United Nations that separates out the good from the bad, and I would believe there's an awful lot more bad, unfortunately, than good, but I'm sure there are aspects of the United Nations that are worth saving. So a congressional inquiry that actually looks in detail at the UN's operations and starts to map that out would be, I think, an extremely useful step in the right direction, either of United Nations reform or of just, abolishing the whole thing and working out a route forward that incorporates some of the positives, and I would say actually bringing the world's nations together in one place for the purpose of discussion. And most of the important conversations, frankly, happen in the corridor outside of the UN General Assembly. But even having the opportunity of a public discussion in the General Assembly is not necessarily a bad thing. But the moment votes happen, what on earth is the point? When the new leader of Syria has the same voice or the same vote as the whole of Germany. This is not a democratic organization. Who are we kidding here? So discussion is one thing. The minute you introduce voting, I think you're already into serious difficulties at the United Nations. But also, it means if you take that out of the equation, you lose the need for the Security Council, because ultimately the UN wouldn't have any lawmaking power, and this absurd sort of historical situation of the P5 and the elevated status that even the UK enjoys, despite the fact that it seems to have reneged any responsibility that it might have for international peace and order, and really that's a very outdated setup for the current state of affairs.
But how does one explain that Israel has been condemned by the UN like more times in total than all the other countries combined? How does one explain that?
Firstly, because there's an inbuilt majority at the United Nations against Israel amongst the states that either have no diplomatic relations with Israel or have as part and parcel of their foreign policy to demonize Israel at every opportunity, and that's a given. But also because of everything that we have discussed already so far in terms of the cyclical approach of civil society, UN, international courts and tribunals, and the narrative that is developed. It's just very easy. If you are stuck for material and you have a speech to give at the UN, do the dirty on Israel and everyone will cheer for you. Yeah. It's a very easy way of being part of the club and being accepted and being lauded. And it gets to the point, I've spoken at the UN Human Rights Council calling out these practices, including the standing agenda item 7, that exists only for the purpose of condemning Israel. And on one of the occasions I was there, I recall hearing a speech before me that accused Israeli soldiers of rape on the basis of no information. I looked into this subsequently and they were fabricated reports, but it was very interesting to me because very shortly before that, there had been a contradictory report that in fact accused the Israeli army of racism because it did not rape Palestinians.
Oh my God, how is that possible?
So this is the absurdity of the situation that Israel is dealing with, not just at the UN, but the UN is part and parcel of where this circus plays out.
Oh my God. We have to get back to genocide in itself. We were at the legal criteria before we went on some detours. The legal criteria for it, the definition we were on, I think, and then the legal criteria.
Right. So the key issue here is intention. And I think it's worth highlighting that what Amnesty and what South Africa and its application at the ICJ have sought to do is misrepresent statements from Israeli government representatives, Israeli officials, as saying, look, this is genocidal intent. You may recall Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu referring to Amalek, a biblical reference, which essentially evokes the need to destroy entirely an enemy. He was talking about Hamas. Yeah. He was not talking about the Palestinian people. So they have quoted out of context and misrepresented these statements in order to say, look, this is genocidal intent. And the reason it's important to call this nonsense out is because, of course, all of the evidence points to the contrary. Where do we start? First of all, the population has been increasing because these allegations of genocide didn't just start now, right? I remember doing an interview in 2014 during Tzuk Eitan, Protective Edge, a previous operation in Gaza, where my counterpart was alleging genocide against the Palestinians. Look at the population figures. Some people say it, and I think it's a little dismissive, but some people say if Israel's seeking to commit genocide, it's the most incompetent entity in seeking to do this. I think that rather cheapens the topic of discussion, but maybe it's a valid point. The fact of the matter is that consistently Israel has done everything within its power to reduce civilian casualties while Hamas has been increasing them, or doing everything in its power to increase them, including by shooting its own civilians, including from Palestinian Islamic Jihad Hamas rockets that fall short in the Gaza Strip, intended for Israeli civilians, but when they fall short, they kill indiscriminately. They fall without warning. They fall without a proportionality assessment, and they kill Palestinians that are included in this allegation of, Israeli strikes. We have a perfect example in the context of the Al-Ahli hospital on the 23rd of October, 2023, where immediately the world and his wife were saying, this was an Israeli airstrike on a hospital, 500 casualties. Within 5 minutes of the strike, Hamas was putting out this absurd figure of 500 casualties. It later transpired this was a Palestinian Islamic Jihad rocket that fell in the car park, not the hospital. The hospital was intact. But this is part and parcel of this readiness to believe these genocidal lies, about Israel. But looking to intention, we also have to take into account this issue of food, aid, humanitarian assistance, which Israel has been facilitating throughout this war. Actually, in not quite in breach, but in complete over-compliance with its international obligations. The reason I say that is Article 23 of the Fourth Geneva Convention is very clear about facilitating aid being caveated. That obligation to facilitate aid does not apply where this aid is being diverted by enemy forces. We know Hamas has been diverting this aid from the very beginning. Before we even had videos of them commandeering the aid delivery trucks, it was clear that Hamas controls Gaza, and therefore aid going in is being diverted by Hamas, and this is how they've been fueling their war machine for the last year and a half. Despite the fact that Israel therefore has no obligation under international law to facilitate aid, it has been doing so because it doesn't want Palestinian civilians to starve. And now it has created this separate aid delivery mechanism through the centers that it has established with American contractors and with the support of the Americans. And the most bizarre aspect of this is that the UN and civil society organizations and the international community are saying, oh, no, this is terrible. Because Hamas is upset about it. Hamas doesn't want aid delivery mechanisms to happen that exclude its ability to divert the aid. And the international community have been supporting Hamas in decrying this new initiative to provide aid to Palestinian civilians. Not only that, Hamas have been telling Palestinian civilians not to go to these aid distribution centers. This is a famine. This is starvation. When Hamas is telling people not to go and collect aid from these distribution points, it makes a mockery of certainly of the international reporting. But coming back to the intention aspect of this, all of the evidence is in the complete opposite direction. Israel is doing everything to protect civilian life, to provide humanitarian assistance to Palestinians in Gaza, and the Palestinians in Gaza recognize this. I saw in November interviews by Ohad Chemo, an Israeli journalist, who went into Gaza and he was just holding out a microphone as Palestinians were leaving Jabalia, I think it was at the time, and they were grabbing the microphone from him and they were criticizing Hamas. They were blaming Hamas for having brought this destruction onto their heads, and they were thanking Israel. Thank you for providing humanitarian corridors. Thank you for protecting us. Thank you for providing humanitarian aid. You are helping us while Hamas is killing us. This is what they said. Now, these interviews didn't feature at all on the international media. Why?
They break the narrative.
They break the narrative. They don't fit with the agenda.
I feel like it's so surreal. It's like we're living in this upside down world. It's like it's so strange. And as you say, also, I remember seeing these these brave souls of these Palestinians who were brave enough to actually hold demonstrations in Gaza. And they weren't demonstrating against Israel or IDF, as the world media is telling us that they would probably do. They are demonstrating against Hamas. And how does one square that? Because it would be so much less of a risk for them to actually demonstrate against Israel. That would be in tune with the Hamas narrative. But they are actually brave enough to demonstrate against Hamas that we know is probably leading to their deaths.
And you know what's truly unacceptable is the way the international community have completely abandoned these people.
Yeah.
Worse than that, uniquely, Palestinian civilians are now prevented from leaving a war zone. Contrary to its international law obligations, Egypt sealed that border that it has with Gaza to anyone who reportedly cannot pay $10,000 to be able to leave. That is a breach of Egypt's obligations that it signed itself up to under the African Union Convention of Refugees, which has a much broader definition of refugee than the International Convention. It includes civilians fleeing civil disorder. What happened to Egypt's obligations here towards those Palestinian civilians? And why has the international community decided that these Palestinians need to be used as political pawns against Israel to make its war against Hamas so much harder, to maintain Hamas's use of civilian shields, rather than evacuating these Palestinians the other side of the border with Egypt into Egyptian Rafah, where there is more space than you know what to do with. It's part of the Sinai Desert, to set up a humanitarian zone there where they can be provided with humanitarian assistance without limit, without diversion by Hamas, where Hamas cannot abuse humanitarian zones to fire missiles onto Israel as it has done with al-Mawasi and with other areas in Gaza. Why has no one in the international community been calling for this? In fact, the first person who did, President Trump, who said Palestinians should be allowed to leave this war zone, just like any other civilians in a war zone, if they so choose, he was resoundingly criticized. He was accused of ethnic cleansing, of forcible transfer of people, which, of course, it was never part of what he said. He said if Palestinians want to leave, they should be permitted. And again, this inversion that we're looking at, the so-called supporters of human rights, of decency, the so-called people who claim to be concerned for the lives of ordinary Palestinians are the very ones that are abusing them and that are endorsing and assisting Hamas's continued abuse of these people too.
It's as if in order to maintain the blood libels against the Jewish state and the Jews, you need to keep the Palestinians in a perpetual state of being victims and being refugees and being slaughtered and being exposed to crimes against humanity, crimes against violent crimes from Hamas, to be able to keep that frame, to be able to keep that narrative of what's going on. But the ICJ case from South Africa, what's in it for South Africa in particular to bring this before the court? Why them?
So there have been all sorts of media reports into potential funding that they've received from Iran. I don't know the veracity of those, but I do know from having been in South Africa a couple of years ago on a speaking tour. I remember going in, I had a couple of hours off in the afternoon. I thought I'll go and do something cultural. I went into the Museum of Contemporary African Art. And the first room that I walked into, the first exhibit, Yasser Arafat was staring down at me from every wall. And it was an exhibit, Artists Against Apartheid, Artists Against Zionism. And I started to understand how baked in this anti-Zionist narrative was in so much of South Africa's culture as well as its political discourse. And so I think that ultimately fed in to the willingness of South Africa to advance what is an absolutely heinous blood libel. I also don't think that South Africa thought it was going to be ultimately successful on the merits here. And of course, the sands are shifting and the received wisdom is changing, and now it's acceptable to accuse Israel of genocide. And that was ultimately their aim. I was on South Africa's version of the BBC, SABC, immediately after the first provisional measures order was handed down in that case. And my counterpart said, "Isn't it marvelous? Now we can finally use Israel and genocide in the same sentence and nobody can tell us otherwise." And so ultimately this was part of the motivation to shift the Overton window, to shift the acceptable parameters of the debate and the language that one is allowed to deploy.
And I feel like just the fact that there is a case from South Africa against Israel, I feel like the media and NGOs are so abusing this fact and using it as, there's a legal case against Israel on genocide, so we have to take that into account, and it's like almost as if they're saying that says a lot, just there being a case. And as I understand, that's not the same, because I think people draw parallels from that to saying that, like, if there was like a legal case towards an individual for like murder or something, then
no smoke without fire.
Yeah. And
which is actually even worse in this case, because even the provisional measures orders that the court has issued have been utterly misrepresented in the press and also by legal professionals, which is utterly inexcusable. And one key example of that is this notion that the court found that there was plausible genocide or a plausible risk of genocide. And the court found no such thing. The court talks about plausible rights, which is an assessment of whether the rights that South Africa is claiming on behalf of the Palestinians ultimately fall under the Genocide Convention. Is this a case that falls for the court's consideration? That was what was considered as part of the provisional measures process. It did not consider the merits. It did not consider Israel's case at all. But even after the former president of the ICJ, Joan Donoghue, came out on BBC on Hard Talk to correct the record on this and to say, actually, we never talked about plausible risk of genocide. We talked about plausible rights. Even after she did that, people are still misrepresenting this provisional measures order. And I saw, evidence that was being given by the PLO representative in the UK, Rossum Zumlot, to the Foreign Affairs Committee in Parliament saying this, and nobody was calling him out on it. So, the reality, the actual legal processes, all of that is thrown out of the window in favor of the misrepresentations of this in the international media and elsewhere.
Because I think a lot of people, the normal, ordinary people on the street, think that there's like a parallel there. And in saying that, there wouldn't be a case against an individual for murder if there wasn't like substantial evidence. It would be thrown out by the court system if there wasn't something. But as I understand, the international law system doesn't work like that. It's not the same thing to say that. It doesn't mean that there is any plausibility for Israel, in fact, committing genocide just because it's a court case against them.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Yeah. But also just bear in mind the makeup of this court throughout much of these proceedings. So Joan Donoghue left as president and was replaced by Judge Salam, who was formerly Lebanon's ambassador to the United Nations, where he accused Israel of being a terror state, accused it of war crimes. In any other legal institution, in any other court, of course, he would have been required to recuse himself, not here. He was a driving factor, a driving force in so we understand, pursuing many of these proceedings against Israel and in fact, getting to them sooner than the court might otherwise have. And since he's left, one only needs to look at his Twitter. He's gone back into Lebanese politics now. One only needs to look at his Twitter feed to understand what his position is. So I think everything that's coming out of the International Court of Justice really needs to be taken with that significant helping of salt and that context and to be properly understood.
A Norwegian law expert that you're going to meet later today at the debate at Jung's down in the city center here in Oslo, Cecilie Helles Tveit. I've talked to her also about this stuff. And she says that when I ask, do you think Israel will actually be sentenced by the courts for genocide? And she says that objectively that will depend a lot on the pending outcome from the 2019 ICJ Myanmar case regarding the threshold of genocide, and that the courts will use that. Do you have a comment to that?
I'm not so sure that I believe the assessment now will ultimately be made on the application of law. I see the narrative around Israel and genocide becoming so divorced from the application of law and the facts that ultimately the ICJ is becoming a political body as opposed to a court. And so I don't unfortunately share the same faith that it will necessarily. I thought when South Africa originally brought this application, even the South Africans didn't have much faith in getting home on the merits. But now I think with the shifting sands that might in fact be changing. One of the key issues in terms of assessing genocide is to do with the intention to commit genocide being the only reasonable inference of the activity. So the difficulty with a situation of armed conflict, where Israel is legitimately fighting Hamas terrorists, and it is killing people, that, of course, is the overriding, the not just the only reasonable inference, but that is the stated war aim of Israel. And that is reflective of its conduct here. It's also reflective of its conduct in seeking to prevent civilian casualties, providing warnings of those strikes, and also preventing hunger by facilitating aid, providing medical assistance. It took medical teams into Al-Shifa when it went in to root out Hamas terrorists to treat civilians. It set up field hospitals in Gaza to treat civilians. So one thing I would say, and the reason that case law of the ICC and also of the ICJ to a certain extent is significant, is that there has been this requirement of special intent. And it is a high threshold that needs to be crossed, that to prove genocide, that you need to be sure that this is the only real reasonable inference. And there are lots of efforts now to amend that, to broaden the definition of genocide, to widen it. And some of the reports that we've seen in the Amnesty International report on genocide is explicit that it is seeking that amendment to international law. So we'll have to see how that case law develops. I think the fact that this case is pending at the ICJ in relation to Israel has an enormous impact on the academic discourse and the kind of general manipulation and movement on international law in this direction too.
What's your gut feeling telling you? Do you think that the courts will actually be corrupt enough to actually land on and sentence Israel for genocide? Do you think that could happen?
So it just be slightly careful in terms of conflating, obviously, the ICJ, which is a court that deals with states, rather than the kind of sentencing language that one applies with respect to individuals, which is the preserve of the ICC, which we haven't really talked about very much, but is a whole nother mad situation. What are the odds? There are so many moving parts. It's very difficult also, the memorials of South Africa and Israel's response are not in the public domain. And ultimately, the court itself is going through certain changes. The bench, the makeup of the bench, there's a new president, things have changed. So I think it's very, very difficult to predict. But ultimately, I think the credibility of the ICJ is hanging in the balance. And what the ultimate outcome on this absurd genocide allegation will necessarily be a determining factor, I think, in whether this body has any longevity as a court, or whether it is simply recognized as a political body that has been completely overtaken by political agenda. What
would be the correct terminology instead of sentencing? What would you say, like, if they landed on genocide?
So the enforcement mechanism under international law is essentially the preserve of states. So it's likely that if the ICJ came out, and this will be a few years from now, this is going to take quite a lot of time, then there would be a movement for UN resolutions that address what the consequences of that should be. I mean, the fact is that there are already moves at the UN to seek to sanction Israel and to seek to impose all sorts of penalties on the Jewish state. For the most part, these are political resolutions. It's only UN Security Council resolutions under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter that actually have binding effect. These are few and far between. And again, to a certain extent, ultimately, the ability even to make law in that case is influenced by politics, because each of the veto members can stop something like that from taking place.
So instead, like, of sentencing, it would be like a conclusion or something. The court concludes that. So
it would be a finding.
Yeah. And the ICC, on their part, they're trying to arrest Netanyahu, and from this guy who was just assumably did this to shift the focus away from himself and the sexual allegations against himself.
So there have been reports. This is Karim Khan, the current prosecutor, who's been suspended for that reason, for this investigation. The timing of this application for arrest warrants is I think, deeply problematic in light of what we have been reading in the press. But far more important than that, I think, are the fundamental failings. I'd say there's three significant ones. The absence of jurisdiction. Israel is not a party to the ICC. The Palestinians are not a state, for some of the reasons that we were discussing earlier. This is a court that gets its jurisdiction from member states. Member states delegate their jurisdiction to the court. The court has no jurisdiction to investigate Israelis here, and certainly not to apply for arrest warrants. Then there's this breach of the court's rule of complementarity. This is a court that was instituted to complement domestic jurisdictions, not to replace them. There is an expectation that Israel be afforded the opportunity to investigate and prosecute any credible allegations, and that has not been permitted. In fact, the timing of the application that Karim Khan put forward is said to have been the very day that Israeli officials were meant to meet court officials to discuss their concerns. So that's been thrown out of the window. But the third major problem here is that these arrest warrants have been based on entirely false information. And my organization, UK Lawyers for Israel, conducted a thorough analysis of Karim Khan's public statement, summarizing his application, and demonstrated that every phrase of every sentence of that statement was false. This is the information that has gone to pre-trial chamber 1. that has misled this court, and this is the false basis upon which these warrants have been issued.
And how would you ever enforce that that kind of arrest warrant? Because isn't it so that heads of states enjoy diplomatic immunity when they travel to different countries? How would you be able to breach that immunity?
That's absolutely right. And I think it's one of the reasons that many states have been equivocal as to whether or not they would enforce these warrants. So the United Kingdom, for instance, when it was asked whether they would arrest Netanyahu if he attended, the response from Number 10 was, the UK will comply with international law. Now, I see within that an acknowledgement that the international law on official and diplomatic immunity is important here. The UK's responsibility state to state to Israel. It is only member states of the ICC that waive that immunity on behalf of their officials and diplomats in the context of, ICC proceedings. Israel has not done so. So seeking to enforce an arrest warrant which is not valid, which is made by a court without jurisdiction in breach of its own rules and on the basis of false information, would also be a breach of customary obligations by these states towards Israel on the basis of these provisions on immunity. That's absolutely right.
I wonder what would happen then if that was actually to happen, say hypothetically, Netanyahu was to travel to Norway for some weird reason. And he would land here and he would be arrested by Norwegian police. Wouldn't that cause a huge international crisis in diplomatic relations, like everything? What would happen then?
Which is why I don't think it's going to happen. Yeah. I think it's important to recognize that the issuance of these warrants in such a public fashion is unprecedented. Usually warrants at the ICC are issued in secret so that the individuals subject to them do not know about them and they can be picked up if they travel internationally. Not so here. This was a public circus campaign, right? There was a press conference, a public statement, an interview on Christian Amanpour that Karim Khan gave. This could not have been more public. And I think it's one of the reasons that it's indicative that this is not part of a proper legal process. This is part of a PR campaign to seek to rehabilitate this court. Don't forget, the ICC has come under vicious criticism. In its first 10 years of operation, it successfully obtained one conviction at a cost of nearly $1 billion US. It has subsequently been criticized by all and sundry for focusing essentially on African defendants. So what better way to seek to rehabilitate yourself as an international legal institution and win favor and friends than by going after the world's punching bag, the only Jewish state?
Yeah. Also, I'm wondering, what do you think anti-Semitism is at its core?
It's known as the oldest hatred, isn't it? And it takes many different forms. Some of it is projection, as we've discussed, but some of it is hating Jews for whatever it is that is considered to be the ill of society at the time. They can be the capitalists or the communists. They can be the kind of superior overlords or the degenerate scum. It's in every different time, place, culture, and societal context that hatred can manifest itself differently. But ultimately, the singular consistent factor is that it is not based on a real issue. It is based on some imagined evil. And the late, great Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks talked tremendously convincingly, I think, of the evolving nature of anti-Semitism as a mutating virus, where Jews are hated for whatever society considers to be the ill of the time in the context of whatever the presiding order of the day is. So in the Middle Ages, it was that Jews were hated because of their religion. And the blood libel had a kind of religious context element to it in those times. In the Nazi era, Jews were hated because of their race. And the Nazis used eugenics to seek to justify that. But Rabbi Sacks explained today, the order of the day had become international law and human rights. It had taken over even from science. And so the hatred of the Jewish state has manifested, the hatred of the Jewish people, I should say, has manifested itself as the hatred of the Jewish state. And international law and human rights is the medium through which Israel is being attacked. That is the modern manifestation of anti-Semitism. And I think looking at it like that, through that lens, also helps understand this issue that we were grappling with at the beginning. How can these good-willed, good-natured people that want to stand up for international law and human rights, how can they get it so badly wrong? Where Israel is concerned, it starts to fall into place and make sense when you realize that that is the exact mechanism which is being used to deploy this modern manifestation of anti-Semitism.
Natasha Hauser, thank you so much for coming to my podcast here today, and thank you for your time, your work, and your dedication to this.
It's been my pleasure. It's great to have had the conversation with you. Thank you.